Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast on preparing your environment for Copilot for Microsoft 365, brought to you by Insight and Microsoft. Below this webcast, you will see an Attachments tab where you can navigate to after this webinar and find additional information on assets on today's topic. I would now like to turn over this presentation to our speakers, Joe Flynn and Norm Anders. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So welcome everybody to today's conversation. I'm excited about today because we're actually going to go into some of the common asks that customers have when talking about Copilot. And it's going to be specifically around the security stack and more importantly, around the security stack that Microsoft can offer within the technologies that most customers are already paying for, especially the E5 stack. So Norm, let's jump right in. So first question that gets asked a lot by us when we are talking to customers is like, start at the top, right? What if any identity and access controls should be deployed when we're talking about Copilot for 365? Can you just dive in and talk about where identity comes into play, especially around Copilot?
Yeah, sure, Joe. So when you think about identity and access, they're basically two sides of the same coin. And when the first thing I want to talk about is basically that authentication side. We're talking multi-factor authentication that's risk-based. That's basically looking at signals across basically the spectrum with respect to what the user risk is, the sign-on risk, if they're using a Tor browser coming from an unknown location. You know, there could be something up with their device with respect to its risk level or things that may be going on to that. Well, all this ties together basically that the first thing you want to do is that if you're going to protect your environment for Copilot is keep the bad actors out. And multi-factor authentication that's risk-based certainly goes a long way towards handling that. The other side of that is actually the access side of things, where we talk about once you're inside, what is it you can do? And there's two items here that I want to call that work basically in conjunction with one another, is the entitlement management and the access reviews. So entitlement management is all managed out through the governance portal. And that's where you can define access packages and automated workflows for controlling access to applications and SharePoint sites, plus being able to automatically delegate authority to other Purview admins to be able to control and manage access packages, and not to mention being able to connect to, let's say, external entities. So once you have, so that's how you actually define that. The access reviews themselves, you're looking at these access packages where basically access to data across the organization has been granted. You look at those on a time box type of schedule, where you're basically coming back and say, how often do you look at there's a schedule that you basically can set up for these access packages that you want to review on a periodic basis to make sure these people still need to have the access. And that's where you really start to lock down what's really going on and who can access data. And I might add here, especially with Copilot, is that you're concerned about what's going on with stale accounts and also with your guest accounts. So there's where you're basically talking about is being able to if you start formulating and driving all your access capabilities through access packages, you can handle the problems with basically what do guest accounts have access to and make sure that they are time boxed as well or being reviewed on a regular basis, as well as your normal garden variety users. And last but not least is this idea of privileged identity management. And this is basically where you're talking about how can we time box the elevated privileges of admins to make sure that they're able to do the job that they need to do, but they don't have these elevated privileges that could be subject to exploitation by, let's say, people that have actually got into the environment. So those things come together and basically are fundamental. They're fundamental to any environment, but certainly when you're thinking about Copilot and the power of Copilot and its ability to surface and expose things that you don't necessarily want everyone to see, and you certainly don't want to have interlopers in the environment being able to exploit Copilot inadvertently. So, you have the next slide, Joe?
Yeah, and if we back up to how Copilot works, everyone has to understand, right? Copilot uses the context of the user itself. So it's whatever the user is going to have access to from a permission standpoint, that's the data that's going to be used from a user-based index to a Copilot possible response. So protecting that identity is that much more important because if someone gets a hold of that identity, right, it just allows them to go through potentially using the leverage of AI and Copilot to go through that data or go through what the user has access to that much faster. Now, next question, data protection. Like we always talk about from an E5 or security standpoint, it's always protect at the door, which we just spoke about regarding the identity. Then it's usually data and then it's device. From a Copilot perspective, let's dive into the data world, obviously, because Copilot is nothing but data. It's indexing pretty much the entire tenant. It's doing user-based indexing, tenant-wide indexing. So how can you customers drive security, right, around the data so they don't prevent data leakage? And if we look at the biggest, I'm going to say concern, right, for most customers is data leakage, because they simply a lot of times don't know how much data they have and who has access to it. So Norm, where would you drive that conversation for customers and recommendations around the data protection?
Well, there you're talking about basically protecting that other 20% of that data. And the first thing out of the gate, and you need to understand, is that customers need to be on their way, regardless of Copilot or not, towards being able to classify and label their sensitive data. So sometimes this can seem like a formidable task, but when it really comes down to it, most customers, even though they may have a large amount of data, proportionally speaking, you're somewhere between 20 to 15% of your data what was considered quasi-sensitive, and out of that grouping, there's only probably about 5% that's super sensitive. So the idea here is you're using basically the Microsoft Purview capability to able to classify and label sensitive data and apply the appropriate permissions and encryptions on it. In addition to being able to define data loss prevention policies that go further in respect to being able to share and make that data available to, let's say, whoever should be out there. So basically, we're talking about needing to be able to protect that so you're not going to lose it. The other item here too is this item of being able to train your users. It's very important. I say this before, and I say this a lot. Is that excuse me. No matter what security controls you may have in your environment and how good they can be and how well they're defined and configured, if your users are uneducated and they don't know exactly what the parameters, good operational parameters would be for secure operations, they'll have trouble. It's just like having all the safety features in a car doesn't make you a good driver. You can still crash the car and have big trouble. Consequently, you need to think about training your users on data protection and what that really means. They need to understand the importance of the data and what they're doing with it. And the fact is that they are all stewards of the data and they need to protect it the best they can. And regardless of the number of controls that have been put in place, the end users themselves are the ones that are basically the first line of defense. So again, concentrate on being able to train those users on data protection, as well as just general overall security hygiene and like. Last but not least, go ahead, Joe, sorry.
No, I can relate to the car analogy because having a dad of daughters, yeah, trust me, all the technology that comes in these cars nowadays, from automatic braking and everything else, still doesn't make them better drivers. So completely relate to that analogy.
Yes. And that kind of like in the same vein, you need to have a process and procedures in place to monitor and respond to your incidents as they're coming up. So you don't want to be able to try and invent what it is you need to do to track down some sort of incurrence of some sort of data irregularity. You need to have that in place already and be able to monitor that and be able to watch those activities as a normal course of business.
Excellent. Now, this is great, right? Because we talked about identity, we talked about data. Now we get to the device. And a lot of times customers do ask is, if I am protecting the data and if I'm protecting my identity, why should I care about the device? Now we got to understand, as Copilot evolves, there's Copilot for Windows 11, there's Copilot for Microsoft 365, or just regular Copilot in the browser. All of them can be used, right, on the device. More importantly, all of them can be used on any device as long as the user has access to them, based on whatever controls a customer drives in there. But when we look at the device, remember I said if a customer gets hold of a person's identity around our first slide, then ultimately they have an easy way to access that data on what the user has access to. The device is going to be no different at this point. If a user gets access to the device, they're ultimately going to have access to what the user can get to and the tools that the user has on that device to be able to leverage Copilot to search, right? To search for the data, to pull data back, to query what else the user has data to. And depending on how far they go, if they're leveraging automation and everything else in the back end with that same user account, then they're going to have bigger concerns because now they're going to be able to take advantage of the automation that may be tied behind it. And I think this is where the E5 comes in from a device perspective. Now, from a Microsoft world, everything does start from an Intune. So you can do your security baselines in Intune. We can do conditional access with Intune. We can set up compliance policies potentially to where the device has to be specific version. It has to be possibly joined to the domain or joined to Azure. And then we can tie that into conditional access policies at the same time, to where we're possibly forcing multi-factor authentication, possibly forcing Windows Hello. But then we can get into the advanced features of Defender for Endpoint, whether we're looking at just the endpoint DLP, endpoint analytics, Ideally, what's happening on that device at the same time, we can correlate all of those signals and everything from a cloud perspective, and not only tie it into what's on the device, but tie it into what's potentially going to be happening from a cloud perspective. Norm, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's the fact is that that again, I look at devices just as like identity as the first line of defense and its perimeter that's out there, that's exposed and is kind of by itself out there, that it needs as much protection as possible. And that's where again Microsoft Defender for Endpoint comes into play there. And keep in mind too is that there's an element of this almost this real-time risk that's associated with the device that comes into play with respect to as you said, the advanced conditional access policies and this idea of this continued automated evaluation. So you're constantly looking at what the current threat level is of that person, that device, and what they might be up to. And you could see where there could be a revocation of session tokens and the like that basically would force maybe a re-authentication with MFA possibly. So again, devices are a key part of that, and that's where Defender for Endpoint comes into play very heavily. So.
Okay, now question. Now we're gonna I want to try to just throw a curveball at you here. But from a device, if we look, again, going to repeat myself, identity, data, device, is there certain priorities that you think a customer should implement those, or shall I say, set up and configure those types of technologies in any specific order?
Well, I lean towards, well, number one is I lean towards the privileged identity management. I do for devices, for endpoints, absolutely. At the same time, you could be working towards cleaning up your conditional access policies and make sure that they're as robust and complete as possible with respect to the this idea of risk that may be coming into play. So yeah, so in a sense, there it's privileged identity, devices, and then conditional access policy, but they almost have to come together. I don't want to put that as a priority as who's most important, but those are the three areas I see the most vulnerable and the ones that need to be approached initially right out of the gate.
Okay, perfect. And I do agree. I think the conditional access is so powerful because you have the ability to pull in things like the rating from a Defender for Endpoint, or are they in a location that is a high risk, and other factors of what the other technologies can pull in. The conditional access can take advantage of those to be able to allow a user access or not to what they're requesting. I love that piece of the puzzle. Okay, now we talked about protecting the data. What about sensitive data in regards to, like if I'm, you and I, we both have Copilot today. And if I try to type something, I'll be honest, in most companies, oversharing is probably the biggest concern when they turn on Copilot. I think we're all humans, and a lot of times it's human nature to take the easy way out at times. And we see it in many customers we speak to. We see it in many companies that we help understand their data landscape. And with OneDrive, right, the biggest thing they have is when you right-click a file, you have the ability to share to the entire organization. You have the ability to share to anonymous, so public, or you have the ability to share to specific people. Those are the three most common shares that OneDrive or SharePoint offers. And now the problem is if customers don't secure how the end users can share items, most users share to the entire organization. Doesn't matter the content of the file. They tend to take the easy way out and share to the entire organization. So the problem is now most users have access to confidential files, sensitive files that they should never see. And most times they're probably never going to know they have access to it. But now here's where Copilot comes in, because they're going to be typing a question pertaining to maybe what may be in one of those sensitive data file types. And now the data is going to come forward. Right? It could be job ending for some people because it's data that should not be public or data that should not be shared even with people within the company. So when we're talking about data protection, Norm, and in your conversations with customers, I know on the slide we're talking about restricted SharePoint search, but kind of tell me why a customer should do that. But more importantly, do you see any cons to the SharePoint restricted search?
Okay, well, I'd say the biggest con with a SharePoint restricted search is that it maybe takes the urgency out of getting your data hygiene taken care of for your data estates, but people have to just use some discipline in that sense. So that would be the biggest risk, is that you're going to basically limit right out of the gate, and you're never going any further with your Copilot environment. But the good side of this is that you don't necessarily have to pump the brakes and stop your deployment of Copilot just because you don't have your data estates ready yet. And this is the ability here to use this restricted SharePoint search, where you could limit what you're actually going to be looking for initially so you can get your feet wet and get people moving. And you can still have people be able to leverage Copilot against their own files and files that they were shared with other users. So you still have capabilities there, but you're limiting the scope that basically Copilot can see across the organization until such time you can straighten up and get the classification and labeling in place that protects that data from being inadvertently shared. Because as we know, the Copilot will respect the capabilities or the authorizations that user may have and don't go beyond those boundaries. So the main key there is to get the boundaries in place as quickly as you can. Use the restricted SharePoint search to be able to get your feet wet and get used to using Copilot. And then as you slowly clean up your data estates and get that straightened out with respect to your proper labeling and then you can actually go ahead and start to open that up and go forward with it. And now with respect to what you talked about with the oversharing, with the SharePoint Advanced Management, it does give the ability there to basically manage your content sprawl, but basically as a tendency is that there's tremendous amounts of data that shows up, and this gives you an ability to start managing that and cleaning that up. In addition to giving your oversharing control, doing actually a lifecycle management of your content, and then you can actually go back and analyze the usage patterns of what people are using and how they're doing it. So this is basically a hand-in-glove solution here, where you're basically using the restricted SharePoint search to get yourself started and get yourself rolling on Copilot without overexposing what it is that those folks are having access to. And then being able to leverage the SharePoint Advanced Management to clean up the backside the same time you're doing your data estates hygiene with Microsoft Purview.
Well said. Love it. Absolutely love it. Okay. I know this is your sweet spot, and I know it's something you like to do, but I mean, does E5 provide additional availability around threat protection that can help with Copilot? What is your take on that piece, Norm?
Well, this gets back again, just even with Copilot out of the picture, these are the solutions that come together that really give this single pane of glass, this holistic view of what's going on with the environment. And that starts out with Defender for Endpoint. It gets back to what's happening in those end devices that are scattered here and yon, and we need to keep touch with those and know what's happening with that as well. The Defender for Identity is fundamental. It has the identity protection in there, but also has hybrid users to be able to watch what's going on across their on-prem environment, to look for these lateral movements and indications that there could be some ill behaviors afoot with respect to someone that might be sneaking around in their environment trying to do something bad. Couple that up with Defender for Cloud Apps, where you can bring your own devices and run those through this CASB and watch what people are doing. In addition, depending on the risk of that machine or that user, you can also push them back down through Defender for Cloud Apps to give that better scrutiny and monitoring of what's really going on with that particular site or that particular user. And then, of course, there's just Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. That gives you that front-end protection with respect to phishing and malware and the badness that comes along with bad links and things that come back just through the email side of the world.
And one thing, and I'm shocked you didn't say it, but one thing I like that you always say is this is all part of E5, right? So keep that in mind if a customer does own E5. But the best part is these tools all can talk to each other. So I can set up like the conditional access policies or risk analysis, things, all those based on what comes out of Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps specifically, right? Because you can do session-based monitoring, especially to those third-party SaaS-based apps where you want to make sure your data is not going in certain places. Now, I know that doesn't really pertain to Copilot specifically, but it's about protecting the overall environment, your users, and your data at the same time.
Exactly.
Okay, so Zero Trust principles. Now, we talked about E5, we talked about Copilot and the recommendations and the common questions around what customers should do or what you should start thinking about when trying to implement Copilot and how to make sure you're secure. And Norm, before I throw my question to you, what we commonly say to customers is the best practices of what we've been trying to communicate over the past 5 or so years, right? Since Office 365, let's say around the 2015-16 timeframe and up, right? The best practices on what to configure, how to configure it, what security settings you should do, what policies you should do. Those best practices are pretty much very still recommended today. If not, it's more important because Copilot is going out there and capturing more data for what your users have access to. And like we said, that most likely they don't realize they have access to. Now, from a Zero Trust, we know Zero Trust is no tool, right? Zero Trust is a framework. How would you dive into that framework across all these tool sets?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is if you think about if you're going from left to right, if you verify explicitly. And that's where you bring in Microsoft Entra ID. And to a certain degree, you're talking about data loss prevention and the like. You're basically saying, who are you, what can you do, and where do you need to go? And so that ties back with that verify explicitly. The concept of least privilege access ties back in with the privileged identity management, and then being able to basically say that who can access what data and how might they be able to access it. So again, only give access to what they need to access with respect to whether it's administrative roles or it's just basically accessing data. Defend for endpoint, again, is like, again, I think we stress this enough, maybe beat it like to death, but in a sense here, but, again, the endpoints are just as important, I believe, as identities, and certainly as vulnerable as identities, and they need that constant scrutiny and supervision and the like to make sure that they're healthy and they're doing well. I'm not sure if I'm answering your questions or not here, Joe. Am I doing okay here?
No, it's great, because what we're trying to get to customers is, if you're looking to buy E5, if you already have E5, these are tools you have in place. So what we want to express is Copilot or not. Like I said, Copilot definitely makes this a ton more important. But even if you don't have Copilot, like these tool sets, whether from a DLP all the way down to Defender for Identity, they should be set up, because what's happening, if you look in the world today, there's probably, Norm, you've done a lot of research here just from our side for customer conversations. There's breaches every day, right? There's fines, there's people paying ransomwares, and a lot of times it has to do with the weakest entry, a lot of times which ends to be a user side. And I think these tools coming from an E5 perspective can help alleviate some of that. It may not totally block it, let's be honest. I think a lot of totally blocking, I think the best thing you could do is probably disconnect completely, but we know that's not practical at the same time.
Yes.
But I think this could deter it. This could semi-prevent it. I also think this could keep the blast radius down if something does happen. But more importantly, I would think it will help customers feel a little more secure than where they may be today. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, what's important here is that you see this list of solutions, and you may think that they're standalone and they're all by themselves, but as you mentioned earlier, they're fully integrated and tied together. So they basically are drawing upon one another, they're feeding one another, and they're basically providing telemetry to one another to basically give this holistic view about what's really going on in the environment, and specifically with that person and what they're up to. And again, from an administrator's perspective, or someone that's basically a GRC type person, you can see that a single pane of glass across what's going on with DLP, what's happening with authentication and authorization, what may be going on with the vulnerabilities to the endpoints, what's going on with cloud app security, and who's doing what with basically sharing data. And then, of course, with Defender for Identity, you can see what's happening across the entire on-prem environment and how it relates back to the cloud. So all these, they're not necessarily individual standalone products. They're all integrated together to give you this holistic view about what's happening in your solution set, basically your environment. I'll stop right there.
No, and I think it's great to finally hear the term single pane of glass and actually be a reality. Just from a device world, we talked about unified endpoint management for years about the single pane of glass, and it was never a real reality up until now. And I think these tools are same, right? Now we have that means of a true single pane of glass. So from a support person, from a security person, they can kind of see a holistic view of the entire environment, but also what is a person, what's happening with the data and what's happening with the device at the same time.
Yes, and that key there is that basically the user device risk is dynamic and changes over time, and you need to have that ability to monitor that and react to it as it does change, and that's what these products come together and do.
Agreed. Now, from an E5 perspective, we talked about only a couple items, right? We talked about a few items that may pertain to Copilot and may help you make your environment a little more secure overall, but also assist with the security side of users using Copilot. But here, this is a lot of data, this is a lot of tools, and this is everything that's part of Microsoft 365 E5. So, things we simply just haven't really mentioned, right? Insider risk, auto labeling in that sense, customer lockbox. So Microsoft doesn't have access to your tenant. Norm, some key things here is, I know one thing I talk about the most lately has to do customer key. So bringing your own encryption key to the cloud. So you own the unencryption piece. But what are other pieces here you find customers always asking about or talking about the most?
Well, certainly one that comes to play here is we think back about being able to manage the sensitivity of data and making sure it's labeled properly. Certainly, we can go back and do that in the back end process and label the data that's actually there. But the question is, what happens when new data is born? What happens when new data is being created? And that's the purview auto labeling is key here. Being able to when data is basically being created, it's being labeled properly. So from its inception to its basically sunsetting, it's being properly managed and protected with respect to the security controls that have been defined for it. I think that's fundamental, being able to keep those data estates in good shape with respect to not having them drift and have data that's out there that's unprotected. Privileged identity management, I think, is key there with respect to being able to lock down and control and audit what's going on with those admin type roles and the like. So other thing that comes into play here is insider risk. This is becoming more and more of a big concern with what's going on with basically companies being able to have their data pulled out unbeknownst to them in ways that they didn't ever even fathom would be possible. So insider risk starts watching behaviors of folks, and they start deciding that maybe this is more, you're starting to become, I think, I wouldn't say provocative, but to a degree, you might be doing things that would tend to raise your risk level up, and consequently, adaptive risk policies come into play that start to shrink down and control what that user might be able to do, predicated upon what their current risk level is, based upon what their behavior is. So this is fundamental to be able to support. Again, if you have an interloper inside the environment, or maybe you just have someone that's either malicious in the sense is that they're trying to hijack your data, this is a way to lock that down. And certainly Copilot it could be an instigator, or basically a big helper with this. If someone's trying to maliciously pull data out of your environment to go find it, Copilot can be very helpful in that area. So this is where insider risk comes back and tempers the other side of that, where he basically says, normally we'd let people go see this data, but the way you're pulling it out, it looks suspicious, and we're going to start to slow you down and raise alerts and start bringing people's attention to the fact that it looks like you're unloading our entire SharePoint site. Other than that, I'm thinking that again, it's a full menu of things that are basically that are awesome here. Identity protection is a big one. We're basically talking about keeping track of people's identities out in the dark web, and when they become compromised, go ahead and raise the risk level of that user, and consequently apply the appropriate conditional access policies. I mentioned entitlement management, risk-based conditional access policies. And these are all in here, and I don't know where else to begin. It's just like I could go round and around the circle, but all of them are essential to be able to provide the level of security and the security posture I do believe that's being demanded by just society or the modern environment.
And I think the best part is, right, this is all a single platform, right, from a cloud perspective. Mm-hmm. Single pane of glass, potentially you can see everything through. All these tools can talk to each other. So especially, that's what I love the most, right, is the risk-based conditional access, because I can take the risk signals from identity protection, from Defender for cloud apps, Defender for endpoint. When you think about it within here, I can tie some policy to it to prevent the user from either accessing data, downloading data, or doing even just little things, even opening files specific to what they're trying to do. And so this is where the benefit comes in, right? You're buying in with the E5 stack, you're buying into an ecosystem. And I think the best part is it is an ecosystem, so everything is tied to everything. But more importantly, when we talk about Copilot, remember, it's the context of the user. It's going to be based on what your users, how the users use the data, how they share the data, and what people are going to have access to. Now, we also have to keep in mind, there are some boundaries that Copilot has just natively built in, and we've tried on our side to break it, but asking things like salary, compensation, little things like that, Copilot will come back and say it can't search those. Now, let's be honest, there's clever people out there that can always reword stuff to try to get around it. But for the most part, we do find the boundaries that Copilot has built in are usually pretty good. So it's keywords and it's key phrases that they tend to look for that will block. And a lot of it has to do with financial data or something like that pertaining to personal information. But no, one thing I want to say is, if you want to have a conversation, myself, Norm, we talk Copilot, we talk E5 almost every day with customers. So we have a good understanding of what customers are looking for, what customers have what are their concerns from a Copilot perspective, but more importantly, what are their concerns from a security perspective, especially with many people buying and already owning these tools. most customers, even from an insight perspective, buy the M365 E5 stack. And we're finding is a lot of them don't deploy the solutions they have already available to them. They're using a lot of disparate tool sets, and they can do consolidations. They can get some pretty hard ROI with these capabilities. So please scan the QR code to schedule a meeting. We're happy to do it. We want to be able to provide as much information and be able to set you up for success from a Copilot perspective, but more importantly, even from a security perspective. On that note, Norm, I want to thank you. I absolutely love talking to you because you're so detailed, and I think you're amazing when it comes to these technologies. But again, I want to just thank you for your time and hope everyone enjoyed this webinar. And again, please scan the QR code because we'd love to have further conversations.